Good morning, and welcome to a discussion, the first of two videos on patterns of genetic inheritance. Now, before we get into the actual work of studying these patterns, I want you to think a little bit about what you look like, right? Your physical characteristics. All right. Do you have blonde hair, brown eyes, uh, light skin, dark skin? All of this. All right. And I want you to understand that all of this is controlled by genetics. And not just your physical outward appearance, but also some of your internal appearance. All right. What's the pattern of the coronary arteries in your heart? What's your blood type? All of these things, everything about you is controlled by your DNA. And so, um, how do we figure out what exactly your genetic makeup is? Well, there are some things that you can actually do in order to figure that out. Now, um, first, what we're going to do is start by listing a couple of traits. So there's a bunch of traits listed on this slide here, and they are all genetically inherited and easily determined. All right. So answer these questions about your inheritance. And all of these things are external so that you can see them. Do you have a widow's peak? Are your eyes pigmented? All right. Pigmented eyes are brown or black. Non-pigmented eyes appear a very light blue. Are your earlobes attached or unattached? Do you have short fingers or long fingers? Do you have freckles? Can you roll your tongue? Do you have hitchhiker's thumb? Which thumb is on top when you fold your hands? All right, do this. All right, this is genetically controlled, believe it or not. And so those are the characteristics. And do you have mid-digital hair? Now, this is an illustration, a slide that illustrates some of the traits that were on the list in the previous slide. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see that we've got here a free earlobe. See how it hangs down below? All right, that's a free earlobe, and that is a dominant trait. If, on the other hand, you have two recessive alleles, two recessive genes, one from mom and one from dad, your earlobes are attached. See how this one comes straight down into the side of the head. Can you roll your tongue? All right, some people can, some people can't. But tongue rolling is a dominant trait, whereas not being able to do that is a homozygous recessive trait. Do you have a widow's peak? All right, that's the little point. Whoops, that's the little point in the hair here. All right, that's a widow's peak. Whereas if you've got no widow's peak, your hairline is smooth or smoother anyway. When you put your thumb up, do you have a straight thumb or a hitchhiker's thumb? Look at how backward this thumb actually is. All right, so those are the first four. Pigmented irises is a dominant trait, whereas non-pigmented irises are a recessive trait. A couple of other examples. Can you taste a chemical called PTC? You may have done this lab in high school. There's a chemical called phenylthiocarbamide, and some people can taste it and some people can't. If you can taste it, it's awful. Absolutely just ugh. But non-tasters are recessive. Do you have hair between your knuckles on your fingers? All right, that's mid-digital hair, and that is a dominant trait. All right. And finally, when you fold your hands, all right, left thumb on top is a dominant trait. All right. And think about that. Put your hands together and then try to do it the other way with the other thumb on top. Doesn't that feel weird? All right. Because it's something that is literally governed by your genes. So before we get into a discussion of all of this, I want to talk to you a little bit about some terminology that's going to become important. And I've already used a few of these terms. So your genotype literally lists specific genes for a particular trait, all right, written with symbols, usually letters. Now, before we get any further, I recall that you get 2 copies of every gene at the moment of your conception. one from your mother and one from your father. So you can inherit two dominant genes, two recessive genes, or one of each. And what does that all mean? Well, first, alleles, all right? So alleles are different forms of a specific gene at the same position on a chromosome, all right? This should say chromosome, all right? CHROMOSOME, all right? Um, and the alleles occur in pairs. Why? Because you get one from mom and one from dad. So you've got two copies of each of these. Now, we're going to concentrate mostly on genes that only have two alleles so that we can keep this as simple as possible. But I do want you to keep in mind that in some cases, there are multiple alleles for certain traits. Now, those alleles, if assuming that there are only two kinds, come in two different flavors. The dominant allele is one that will always be expressed if it's present. So if you have a dominant allele, that's going to be the trait that people see in you, because it will always mask a recessive allele. So what that means is that if you get a dominant and a recessive, like here, big T, little t, or if you get two copies of the dominant allele, then you will express the dominant trait, okay? Now, on the other hand, a recessive allele is an allele that is only expressed when a gene has two of this type, all right? And so you'd have to have two recessive alleles in order to express the recessive trait, whatever that trait happens to be. And we'll go through some examples of this in a little while. Now, when you put together two different alleles, you come up with a genotype, okay? There are with two different alleles, there are three potential genotypes, all right? You can be homozygous dominant, meaning that you have two copies of the dominant allele. You can be homozygous recessive, meaning that you have two copies of the recessive allele. Or finally, you can be heterozygous, which means that you have one copy. A heterozygous genotype means you have one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive allele, all right? So you've got dominant alleles, recessive alleles, and your genotype can be homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. Okay. Now, the expression of that genotype is what we call the phenotype. This is what the person actually looks like, or what trait they actually express. So by definition, the phenotype is the physical or outward expression of the genotype. Let's take, for example, the earlobe question. All right, we've already said that an unattached earlobe is the dominant trait. Okay, and so the dominant would be this. Okay, and what that would give you is an unattached earlobe. Okay, the recessive allele, which we'll represent with a little e, this codes for an attached earlobe. Okay, so what happens if you are homozygous dominant? All right, so this person here is homozygous dominant. We've got two copies of the unattached gene, all right, or I'm sorry, two copies of the unattached allele. And so what's that person going to look like? That person is going to have unattached earlobes. This person is heterozygous, meaning that he or she has one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive allele. But because there's one copy of that dominant allele, the dominant trait will be expressed, and therefore this person will have an unattached earlobe as well. Finally, the person at the bottom of the list here is homozygous recessive. In other words, two copies of the recessive allele. And because they have two copies, they will have attached earlobes. All right. Now, think about this. What are your genotype and phenotype? Now, you can certainly know what your phenotype is, all right, but you may not know what your genotype is because you'd have to go back and look at your family tree. You'd have to look at your parents and your siblings and that sort of thing in order to figure out what combination of genes you are most likely to have. And even then, even with a thorough examination, it may not always be possible to determine your genotype until maybe you have children. All right, but we'll get into the techniques for doing that in a few moments. Now, before we go any further with this, I do want to point out that dominance, the fact that an allele is dominant, does not mean that it's more common than a recessive allele. All right. A good example of that is freckles. All right. Freckles are actually a dominant trait. Okay. But there are a lot more people who do not have freckles than there are who do have freckles. All right. But if you are a freckled person, you are very likely, at least 50% of the time, to have freckled children. All right. Because it is a dominant trait. Okay. And one more thing, phenotypes are not always physically observable. All right. I want you to know that. All right. I can't look at a person and tell you what their blood type is, for example. All right. Are you A? Are you B? Are you AB? Are you O? All right. I can't tell that by looking at you. I actually have to take a blood sample to do that. So phenotypes are not just the outwardly observable stuff. All right. So how does all of this come together? How does it all work? All right. Well, your genotype is determined at the moment of your conception. All right. So in this illustration, there are three pairs of egg and sperm, and this shows that if you have and this again is the earlobe question, but if you have an egg with a dominant allele and a sperm with the dominant allele, then the zygote will be homozygous dominant. Okay. And therefore we'll have an unattached earlobe. You can see it right there. If you have an egg with a recessive allele and a sperm with a recessive allele, then you're going to end up with a zygote that is homozygous recessive. And this person will have an attached earlobe. Finally, in this, should actually be four of these, but if we have a dominant allele in the egg and a recessive allele in the sperm, or possibly a recessive allele in the egg and a dominant allele in the sperm, then the zygote will end up being heterozygous. All right, and heterozygous, because there's one copy of that dominant allele and one copy of the recessive, will have an unattached earlobe as well. All right, so hopefully that gives you a visual interpretation of the differences between genotypes and phenotypes and how they are determined at the moment of your conception. Okay, so when we look at genetic inheritance, oftentimes we have to look at multiple generations, at least two, a parental and an offspring generation. And so this can be done in a variety of different ways. So we can do this with a one trait cross, which is usually easier to do, at least to think about it mathematically, but it's not always possible. And so therefore, sometimes we have to consider two trait crosses. Now, a one trait cross considers the inheritance of only one characteristic. All right. A two-trait cross considers the inheritance of two characteristics. And you can do this with 3 and 4 and 6 and 8 and so on, right? Especially with computer driven technology these days, we can do a variety of different mathematical calculations. Anyway, so the gametes, the sperm and the egg, each only carry one allele, at least under normal conditions. And so if an individual has the genotype big W, little w, all right, so this person is heterozygous, the question is, what possible gametes can this individual pass on? Well, in this case, all right, if this, for example, is a certain woman's genotype, let's say then she can produce eggs with a big W allele, the dominant allele, and she can produce eggs with a little w allele. As a matter of fact, it should be about a 50-50 split. Right, half of the eggs will be dominant and half of the eggs will be recessive. All right, so she can produce either big W eggs or little w eggs. All right, but each individual egg can only be one or the other. In another example, here's the back to the freckle example. If the father has freckles, all right, and is homozygous dominant, the only sperm that he can produce, or the only type of sperm that he can produce, will contain the dominant allele. There's no option for him to produce a recessive allele because he's homozygous dominant. On the other hand, if mom has no freckles, then the only eggs that she can produce will be non-freckled eggs, all right? Eggs that contain the recessive allele. But what does that mean? Well, that means, honestly, that all of their children will have freckles, right? Because dad is homozygous dominant, he will pass on that dominant allele to every single child, and therefore they will have, all the children in this case will have freckles. So one of the tools that we use in order to determine the potential genotypes for offspring is what's called a Punnett square. All right, these are named after a guy by the name of Joe Punnett. I don't know, that's not really his first name, but Joe Punnett came up with this idea. And essentially, it's a little chart that gives you the probability of the type of offspring that will be produced by a certain pair of parents. All right, they use a grid that diagrams the crosses between individuals by using the possible parental gametes. So if we happen to know that a potential father is homozygous, I'm sorry, if the potential father is heterozygous and the potential mother is also heterozygous, well then dad can produce a dominant sperm or a sperm with a dominant allele and a sperm with a recessive allele. And mom can produce an egg with a dominant allele and an egg with a recessive allele. All right, now we're using the freckles case again. So what's going to happen here? Well, first of all, both of the parents have freckles. All right, think about that, right? Because both of them contain that dominant allele. Now, if the dominant egg and the dominant sperm get together, we end up with a homozygous dominant offspring, and so this child will have freckles. If the dominant sperm and the recessive egg get together, we produce a heterozygous individual who will also have freckles. If the recessive sperm and the dominant egg get together, we produce a heterozygote, which will also have freckles. And finally, if we produce or if we use the recessive sperm and the recessive egg, then we end up with a homozygous recessive individual who will have no freckles. Right? Now, the dark red boxes indicate freckled folks, and the light tannish color will be folks who do not have freckles. All right, and so you can see that in a cross between two hybrid parents or heterozygous parents, we end up with a 3-to-1 ratio of freckled kids to non-freckled kids. All right, and so this is a good way to predict probabilities. Now, does this mean that if this couple has exactly 4 kids, that one of them is not going to have freckles? No, it doesn't. It's all statistically based. It's all probability. All right, so it doesn't mean that this is a done deal, but it does mean that it's very likely that this will happen. Now, I will tell you that the triplet's mother has freckles. I do not. However, 2 of the triplets have freckles, and the third does not. All right, so this, I can use this kind of technique to state that the triplet's mom is a heterozygote, because otherwise, the non-freckled child that I have would not be able to reproduce. So I know that mom's genotype was heterozygous. Okay, so let's do another example of this just to kind of see what happens here. All right, so what would a Punnett square involving a man with a genotype of big F, little f, and a woman with a genotype of little f, little f? So dad is heterozygous, all right, and obviously then, does he have freckles or not? He does, all right. And mom is homozygous recessive, and so therefore she does not have freckles. And so how do we then go about predicting what the offspring in this particular case will look like? Well, the first thing we have to do is figure out what kind of sperm dad can produce and what kind of eggs mom can produce. Well, dad is heterozygous, so he can produce 2 different kinds of sperm. All right, he can produce one with a dominant allele and one with a recessive allele. And so we would expect that 50%, half of his sperm would contain the dominant allele, and half of his sperm would contain the recessive allele. Mom, on the other hand, can only produce eggs that have the little f, all right, the recessive allele. And so, what are the possible combinations? Well, this child would be heterozygous, all right? Does he or she have freckles? Yes. This child is also heterozygous. Does he or she have freckles? Of course. This child, little f, does he or she have freckles? No. No dominant allele here, and so therefore this child will not have freckles. Whoops. And in this case, this child, there we go, will also not have freckles, okay? And so 50%, we would predict then that from a cross between this dad and this mom, that half of the kids would have freckles and half of the kids would not, okay? This is actually quite similar to what I personally experience with my children, 50-50, okay? Ish, all right? But it's tough to do a 50-50 split with 3 kids. All right, so that is that. Now, let's look at another example and use some of the definitions that we've talked about thus far. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's called a genotypic ratio. All right, and this is the number of offspring with the same genotype. So in this particular cross, we have a dad who is heterozygous, and so therefore 50% of his sperm will contain the dominant allele, and 50% of his sperm will contain the recessive allele. We also have a mom who is heterozygous, and heterozygous, and therefore she will produce eggs. 50% of her eggs will have the dominant allele, and 50% will have the recessive allele. If we quickly do the cross, we find that this child, this potential child, will have two dominant alleles. This potential child will have a dominant and a recessive. This potential child will have a dominant and a recessive. And this potential child will have two recessives. Okay? Now, the genotypic ratio is the number of offspring with the same genotype. So remember that we have three potential genotypes in this case: big F, big F, and little f, little f. Okay? And so these are the genotypes. So the genotypic, genotypes. Okay. Now, the ratio in this case, in this particular example, the genotypic ratio well, we've got four potential types of offspring, and we would expect that one of them will be homozygous dominant, two of them will be heterozygous, and one of them will be homozygous recessive. And so, what is the genotypic ratio? Well, in this particular case, it's 1 to 2 to 1. So if we were able to determine what the genotype of the offspring is, or each offspring is, we could predict that 25% of them will be homozygous dominant, 25% of them will be homozygous recessive, and 50% will be heterozygous. All right. And so the genotypic ratio in this case will be 1 to 2 to 1. Okay. 1 to 2 to 1. Now, what about the phenotypic ratio? Well, in this case, there's only two choices. We can be kids with freckles, which is the dominant state, and we can be a kid with no freckles. And so the phenotypic ratio in this case well, how many of these kids have freckles? Well, that's a yes, that's a yes, that's a yes, and that's a no. All right, so 3 freckles to 1 no freckles. All right, and so the phenotypic ratio is 3 to 1. Notice that both of these two are freckles. Oops, spelled that wrong. And this guy is no freckles. Okay. All right. So that's a method of practicing ratios. Okay. So the last thing that I want to point out is that something called a monohybrid cross. And this is defined as an experimental cross in which the parents are identically heterozygous at one gene pair. So, for example, they have big A, little a, big A, little a. All right. So, dad is heterozygous and mom is heterozygous. All right. And that is what you saw on the previous slide. Okay. That this, whoops. Now I can't go back. There we go. This is a monohybrid cross because both parents are hybrids or heterozygous. Okay. Now, in a different example, and just I'm going to share this slide. This picture is not of two heterozygotes. So not monohybrid, but just gives you some other examples. All right, in this particular case, we're dealing with widow's peaks. And so on the left, we have two parents. We have a dad who is homozygous dominant and a mom who is homozygous recessive. All right. Well, because the widow's peak is a dominant trait here, and dad has two alleles that are both dominant, all of the offspring are expected to contain that allele. And you can see that in this case, child, each potential child has the dominant allele and therefore has a widow's peak. Um, on the right-hand side, we've got a dad who is heterozygous and a mom who is homozygous recessive. In this case, we expect the recessive allele to come from mom in all cases, but dad has a 50-50 shot of fertilizing the egg with a dominant allele versus a recessive allele. And therefore, come on. Therefore, we would expect half, in this case, of the offspring to have a widow's peak and half to not have a widow's peak. All right, and so the phenotypic ratio here is 1 to 1. All right, well, it's really 2 to 2, but we can reduce that to 1 to 1. Okay, so that, my friends, brings us to the end of the first video on patterns of genetic inheritance, and I hope you learned something.